Hello and welcome to another Atypical Philosopher video with myself, Jonathan M.S. Pearce. Today, I'm going to talk to you about a particularly egregious opinion or rational conclusion even, and I'll come on to that has been advanced by someone who claims to be a classical philosopher, a teaching professional philosopher. This is their about page, Eve Kaninen. Now, I don't want to necessarily say that they are not what they say they are, but I always find it odd when people hide behind avatars and names that aren't theirs when they are making philosophical claims, especially when those claims are as egregious as I think these claims are. Which is to say that, well, if you're not confident enough in what you're saying about reality, your claims about what you think reality are, then perhaps those conclusions are just a little bit dodgy. Anyway, who is Eve Kaninen? Well, as far as I know, they are, and this is important to what I'm going to say about what they say. It's pertinent. What does all this mean? I'm a professional philosopher. That is, I have a PhD in philosophy, and I've taught philosophy at a number of colleges and universities for around 25 years. I consider myself a philosopher in the classical sense. Also, that is a spiritual follower of Socrates, a questioner who seeks the truth by means of logos, reason in the least worst translation. While I specialize in metaphysics and ethics and the history of philosophy, I've studied and taught many subjects at one time or another, including within philosophy, philosophy of science, aesthetics, epistemology, philosophy of mind, and for that matter, I've studied and taught physics, calculus, literature, poetry, and a variety of other subjects. By calling myself, quote, a traditionalist philosopher, end quote, I mean two things. First, as I said, I'm a philosopher in a classical tradition, which means I regard most contemporary philosophy, such as today's Anglo-American analytic philosophy or continental postmodernism, as temporary aberrations in the history of philosophy. Both are deeply hostile to truth in the classical tradition. The postmodernists want to deny it outright, and the analytics generally want to diminish it to a shadow of itself and end up de facto denying it anyhow. I regard truth, much as Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle did, as something holy and something that is an ultimate good, and all human beings are directed towards by their nature. We are made to know truth. Two, and this is where I think the colours are nailed to the mast here. Second, I am actively hostile to most of the poisonous political ideologies that are rampant in the world today. Most of the ones with power today, and so the most dangerous ones, are on the left. So I tend to appear and be somewhat conservative, not because I haven't thought things through, but because I have. For the most part, I reject nearly all the legacy of philosophical modernity as false and harmful to human beings. I stand with Nietzsche and Heidegger in diagnosing our age as one drowning in the spiritual, moral, philosophical disease of nihilism. And while I agree with both of them, a simple return to the past is impossible, I do not reject the possibility of a rebirth of classical philosophy and Christian theism. So that is kind of the background to who this person claims they are. And I want to bring you to this opinion, this rational conclusion, arguably, that she has placed on Twitter. And I find this whole thread really problematic, and I'm going to tell you why. Sometimes I think we have come a long way. That atheism is firmly ensconced in modern Western societies as an accepted belief. At other times, I am rudely awakened from my pipe dream. I could bring to bear any number of opinions, from politicians to celebrities, but being a philosopher myself, it galls me to read the opinions, no, supposedly the rationally held conclusions of a professional teaching philosopher. So I'll now document the opinions of someone who is probably not comfortable enough to defend their views, as I've mentioned, under their own name, and so blogs and tweets as Eve Kaninen. There is no other word to describe the views she, or for I presume her avatar is at least accurate in that regard, but beware of assumptions, holds. There's no other word to describe it than bigotry. She starts as she means to go on. Plato suggested that there were two kinds of atheists, incurable and those who might be cured. He suggested that a healthy republic would execute the incurable and give the others 7 years in prison to see if they might be cured. As terrible as I mean, this is terrible, right? But it's a form of kind of just asking a question. Some people call it jacking. I'm just asking questions. Hey, but I think this has been twisted into, hey, I'm just quoting someone who suggests atheists should be executed. Meh, that's not a problem. Or do you know what? If they're not executed, let's put them in prison for 7 years. The only reason you would plant that quote there or that reference to Plato is that you broadly agree with what Plato is saying there. And rather than moving away from a kind of literalist interpretation or a literal interpretation of that position, she actually doubles down. So she then says, John Locke, in his very famous essay on toleration, made it an explicit point that a healthy political community cannot tolerate atheism because it is ruinous to a sound polity. Now, Locke's 1689 A Letter Concerning Toleration saw the philosopher exclude atheists from toleration. So, yeah, since he considered them inherently immoral. But Caninen neglects to mention that he also excludes Roman Catholics, whose morals he judged harmful to society. We could, of course, quote from any number of people to support awful viewpoints. Now, where's that copy of Mein Kampf that I don't own? You see the point? It's easy to cherry pick pretty egregious opinions from anyone in history. I mean, all the greats had their blind spot, of course. I mean, after all, they were merely human. Aristotle said that a woman was a defective man and that barbarians were natural slaves. Does she advocate for that? I mean, she mentions her high regard for Aristotle. Hume said that he had heard of a Negro who was a man of parts, but that he had never met one. Surely Hume was aware of the concept of statistically insignificant samples. Augustine and the other church fathers had notorious views about women and sex, as documented, for example, in Uta Ranke Heinemann's Eunuchs for the Kingdom of Heaven, Women's Sexuality, and the Catholic Church. So perhaps I should quote some of Augustine's more hair-raising quotes about women and see if she accepts that authority. After all, church father, etc., etc. But it's demonstrably wrong to say that atheists are immoral, especially when the idea is now of behaviour. Cosmos magazine quotes from researcher Thomas Stahl, who has studied the morality of atheists and theists. The most general take-home message from these studies is that people who do not believe in God do have a moral compass, says Stahl. In fact, they share many of the same moral concerns that religious believers have, such as concerns about fairness and about protecting vulnerable individuals from harm. Perhaps contrary to what one might think, the two groups only differed in a couple of areas. Theists were more likely to endorse moral values that increase group cohesion, and atheists were more likely to judge the morality of an action based on the consequences of action or inaction. Disbelievers are less inclined than believers to endorse moral values that serve group cohesion, such as having respect for authorities, in-group loyalty, and sanctity, explains Stahl. It is possible that the negative stereotype of atheists as immoral may stem in part from the fact that they are less inclined than religious people to view respect for authority, in-group loyalty, and sanctity as relevant for morality, and they are more likely to make moral judgments about harm on a consequentialist case-by-case basis, says Stahl. Atheists are not inherently immoral. In fact, I have argued at length that atheists are more universally moral and better aligned with Jesus' Good Samaritan parable. And you can see I've written an article called Christians, Their Morality and Their Ironic Intolerance, but I've also done a video to look at that, to really support this idea that atheists have a more, I mean, we're talking in generalities here, have a more universal morality, very much like espoused by Jesus in the Good Samaritan parable. And theists have a very much in-group based morality, not as universal. So they're nice to people who are like them, other Christians. You know, if you're a white, straight male, you're going to be more likely to be nice to people who are more similar to you in those respects. But anyway, go and check that video out and my article out. So If the good in the Good Samaritan has anything to do with morality and being moral, then atheists are clearly not immoral, and that's coming from Jesus. Of course, this does depend on how you define moral and immoral. Locke's position, since she is referring to Locke, is nothing if not entirely begging the question in quite the circle. And this is to take a quote from a paper by Diego Lucci, John Locke on atheism, Catholicism, antinomianism, and deism in Ethica and Politica. So he says Locke considered atheists inherently immoral and therefore socially dangerous because of their grievous failure to acknowledge the existence of a divine creator and legislator, which produced the even more grievous failure to recognize and respect any divinely given moral law. Conversely, deists believed in a divine creator and legislator, and thus they were able to appreciate and grasp, although partially and imperfectly, the divine law and their duties towards God. By the light of reason, deists could comprehend and respect at least the basic principles of the law of nature. In other words, their religious and moral views, albeit imperfect, still enable them to meet at least minimally decent moral standards. Consequently, they were not comparable to atheists in that they were not inherently immoral. This idea that you can only be moral if you believe in God. It's kind of begging the question here of what morality is and how it's related to theism and atheism, and so you're starting with the conclusion that they are immoral merely by the definition of them being atheists, and I'd find that hugely problematic. But furthermore, it seems rather pertinent to question whether Plato and Locke held to the same God or religious views as Canaan and vice versa, and what this might entail for all parties here. But far be it from me to bog down the diatribe. Let us return to Eve Canaan. As she says, for some odd reason, the atheists seem to think these views are simple bigotry and carry no weight. But of course, everyone in the grip of a vice thinks those who see the vice as a vice are merely bigots. So not only are we wrong to think these views are bigoted, but that we are in the grip of a vice, as she says. I mean, that is to hammer home the idea, the claim that we are in the grip of, and this is the definition of a vice, an immoral or wicked behavior. We're immoral, and if we say that the view that we're immoral is bigoted, then we're just living in the vice of being immoral. There's no way of getting out of that. You're just, I'm inoculating myself, this is canine here, from having my position critiqued. Right, let's go on to her next part of this thread. Of course, neither Plato nor Locke were bigots, and their condemnation of atheism was for very good reason. Of course, she doesn't establish that; it's just a mere assumption and an appeal to authority. Atheism has always been condemned and detested for good reason. I mean, has it always been condemned and detested? I mean, always. Like now, it's not only by you, but I don't condemn and detest it, and I live now, and that's part of always. Odious, Isaac Newton called it. Well, it must be true then. I mean, do you realize there are an awful lot of things that Isaac Newton said that were entirely problematic? So she says, it's just that we live in a particularly stupid time. So she's now advocating for atheism to be labelled odious, and there is good reason to condemn and contest it, according to her. How far away from hate speech actually is this, I wonder? Plato and Locke were men of their age, but Eve should know better. But for her, stupid, as in we live in a particularly stupid time, stupid appears to be better understood as morally progressed, I would wager. Fear not, my fellow vice wallowers, we are nearly there. We have decided, she continues, against all reason and tradition to attempt to tolerate all manner of vices and evils. In other words, she is saying we have decided against all reason and tradition to attempt to tolerate atheists, to attempt to tolerate people of different philosophical positions than ourselves, to attempt to tolerate people with different worldviews. Just imagine this. Imagine standing up in Parliament and saying, we should not tolerate people of different worldviews to us, different religions, or no religion. We shouldn't tolerate them. This is what we should stand for. These people should be executed or put in prison for 7 years. This is absolutely despicable, in my opinion. And that's a pretty good moral intuition and rational moral conclusion. She continues, it won't end well for us. It isn't going well for us. First rebellion and then judgment. That's the way of things. Goodness. Are we supposed to, against all reason, tolerate the vice and evil of bigotry? It isn't going well for us is just a step to the right from I argue for freedom of speech so I can insult otherwise and essentially oppress others. Kaninen seems to want to rebel against the idea of the Good Samaritan and prefers to dash the heads of atheists against the rocks of orthodoxy. But finally, she says, so, to say it again, atheism is a damned, detestable vice that destroys nations and steadily corrupts and destroys those who suffer from it. Atheists cannot see this because they are in the grip of the vice, but it remains true. I wonder what the most irreligious nations in the world are and whether they are being destroyed. Let's think about that. The Nordic states, Norway, Denmark, Sweden, Finland, those sort of countries. Let's go and have a little look at the most irreligious countries and see if they are the ones that we would pick out as being the most destroyed. Well, here's a pretty comprehensive list. The world's most and least religious countries based on religious beliefs. So we're going to look at the most religious, and you'd assume that the most religious countries are those that are the least destroyed and the least steadily corrupted, and so on and so forth. Well, we've got Somalia, Niger, Bangladesh, Ethiopia, Yemen, Malawi, Indonesia, Sri Lanka, Mauritania, Djibouti, Burundi, Egypt, Thailand, and that will be with Buddhism primarily, Morocco, Laos, Afghanistan, Guinea, Comoros, Myanmar, Senegal, Philippines, Nigeria, Malaysia, Jordan. I could go on. Are these are countries she aspires to? Would she most like to live in Yemen at the moment, or Somalia? Is that where she wants to? Is that what she thinks is the least corrupted countries? We go to the other end of the list, and of course you're going to have China there because it's got atheism as a state religion. So that could be seen as an anomaly or could be representative. You've got China. Well, let's look after China, and of course that's the second biggest economy in the world, so it's doing something right. I guess Estonia, Sweden, Denmark, Czech Republic, Norway, Hong Kong, Japan, UK, Finland, France, so on and so forth. Vietnam, Australia, Netherlands, New Zealand, Belgium. So these countries are what the most corrupted in the world. I mean, if you're going to pick the countries you most want to live in the world, these would be the countries for most people on earth, I would have thought, that would aspire to live in that kind of society. So it's just absolutely ridiculous. This view is truly detestable. But yeah, I guess it just fits in line with what she says on her about page, which is I'm actively hostile to most of the poisonous political ideologies that are rampant in the world today. I think she could have ended that sentence as second, I am actively hostile. And there you go. So, yep, actively hostile she is. I mean, how understanding and empathetic, eh? But the serious point here is that divisive rhetoric against and otherization of the non religious is still apparently alive and well in the US. Someone is being taught by this person, and that is such a shame. When I called her out on her bigotry, she replied in this way. You can see my reply, and then she replies with a quote from Socrates. But this kind of ivory tower insulated hate is the worst of kinds. As I replied to her, indeed, the worst type of bigotry is that which is post hoc rationalized with a layer of sophistry and pseudo intellectualism. It's like you have to try really damned hard to be not very nice. When you want a world full of decent people, kind and generous of heart, I can't help but think sometimes that we've still got a long way to go. When I write in my writing or post videos to advocate for moral progress, acceptance, and a level playing field for the non religious, these attitudes that we see here are straight out of the ark and need to be consigned to the darkest depths of moral evolution. Even our inner fish is better than that.